I'd like to start today with two statements that, to me, I like to have perspective on the scope of things. And there's a couple statements that I'd like to make that they help me gain some perspective. And the first one involves a statement by the Zoological Society of London that came out last year. It was in May of last year. Now, what I've done is take this statement and I paraphrase it in a way that, again, gives me some sense of perspective. And here's how I do it, and we could actually just read the statement if you want. But my paraphrasing of their statement is that if you were to take the entire known history of mankind by conventional science, we have many different ways of looking at things, but if you accept conventional science on the history of mankind, they have them there roughly 1.5 million years of the first human being. If you were to take the entire existence of humankind and compress that into a 24-hour period, okay? I don't know if we should say we, but as a planet at least, we have managed to eliminate roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of all wildlife on this planet in the last 2.5 seconds of the 24-hour period. That is a statement of perspective to me. And so as we speak today, the issues that I will be bringing up, they are serious issues. This is the position I am in. I'm not much for the sugarcoating. I'll do the best I can to be fair. But that's the type of situation that we're dealing with on a planetary level in terms of change. And when I present these things, I'm asking you to think about that. And how does that impact you? Okay. And to me, these things become very profound when I think of something of that magnitude. 2.5 seconds that I lose 1/4 to 1/3 of all wildlife. Something is incredibly out of balance there. Incredibly out of balance. And the second statement has to do with the atmosphere. And the purpose of this statement is to hopefully project to you a sense of how fragile I now regard the atmosphere as being. I didn't start this way, but I am this way now. And the statement is this. If you were to imagine your feet are at the center of the earth and your head is at the surface, so you would be 4,000 miles long, but you're compressed to 6 feet, okay? So you're the length of the radius of the earth. 3/4 of the mass of the atmosphere, that which sustains us, right, is contained within a shell 1/8 of an inch thick over the top of your head. This is the layer of the atmosphere that sustained this planet. Now, my interpretation of that, and I did this myself, it's like I try to put this in perspective. And it's when I see this, I say, we've got an eggshell here. This planet is much more delicate than we might ever imagine. We might think of, 60 miles, it just goes on forever. But in terms of the mass, it's like this eggshell around us. So this is a fragile and delicate environment that is showing the ravages placed upon it. We know the Earth is also very resilient, but I cannot deny those aspects of fragility at both levels that I have expressed to you. Okay, now we get to go on, and this is where I'm hoping. I wonder if that clock is right.
No, it's an hour fast.
Okay, but that's okay. At least just the minutes count. So let's see. So if I go to 4:30, it wouldn't be terrible maybe for the first section. We have to see. Okay, so I'm going to try to bring up some photographs here. And I'm going to let these pictures drive the conversation as much as I can. see if we can get this to work for us. Ooh, you can see? Okay, this will be a chronology, 12 years of research. This is going to be a chronology of this first half, which is going to cover primarily the physical aspects of this issue, planetary aspects and physical aspects. And I will start out with a central claim that I make. And you don't have to accept this claim. I'm not out to persuade any of you particularly. I am out to give you information the best that I can. I am after soliciting your critical thinking and your engagement in this issue, and for you to reach decisions about whether or not you believe the subject of this presentation is real or not. But I'm not out to decide that for you, but I sure as heck am going to try to give you information the best that I can to let you know that I certainly know that it's real from my existence. And this is now, I never intended that this would, let's say, take in a dozen years of my life. I never anticipated that. I don't devote my time to things that I don't think are important. Obviously, I believe and think that this is important. But the central claim would be this. And this would be that since, let's see, it'd be the beginning of 1998, February, January 1998. And that date is not a sharp demarcation that you can say, oh, from here it all happens. Not really the case. But it is a turning point. That date is a turning point in that since the beginning of 1998, my claim to you would be that aircraft have been used. They have been used to disseminate in a systematic way massive amounts of extremely fine particulate matter into this atmosphere. This would be my claim. You will decide over time whether or not you believe that claim or think. I really don't use the word belief. This is not about a belief system. My work is based on research the best I can. Everything I do is in this physical plane, at least in terms of what I'm presenting to you. But that's the claim that I would make. And you will find that I do not use the word chemtrails. I'm particularly averse to that term. I understand it's in the vernacular. I don't worry about whether you're bothering me. I'm just saying I don't use the term. And the reason is a couple-fold. But number one, if we are to communicate on a general level at all levels of society, we have to have language that we can agree upon. And that particular term is a term that was coined. Language in itself is fascinating. The insinuations, the marginalization that can take place just by the sheer existence of a word and how it is used. That particular term has no definition. Okay, you might find a certain journalist, quote, giving it a definition, but in terms of formal language, we simply won't find it. And that means if I ever were to give a presentation to an atmospheric convention or something like that, the word simply has no standing. It has no meaning. So that's why you'll find me using the word aerosol more commonly, primarily because it's accurate. It's the most accurate term that I can come up with. It's not a sexy term. A lot of people need impact. You have a freezing of moist, hot air, right, in the air, and it condenses and it forms vapor that you can see. And then what happens when you watch that over time? It mixes with the surrounding environment and dissipates, right? This is what water vapor does in a gaseous medium, right? Well, a contrail by definition is that same general phenomenon. The definition comes from condensed trail. Condensation means water. This is what it means. It is water freezing and dissipating and mixing with the surrounding environment. Interestingly enough, the cleanest air from the tests I've done, I did the study to figure out what are the best conditions. The cleanest, coldest, dry air is the best for contrail formation. And it actually fits perfectly if you will observe them. Under those, I've done the measurements. This is exactly what fits. Clean, cold, dry air. Okay? Now, let's take on a cloud. This cloud gets a little bit more interesting. And let's bring up the example of the, breathing in cold air. Okay, take another one of you driving. And now you're driving your car. Same general story, right? That I have. Let's say we have a clean car and clean exhaust, and you're up in Michigan. Now, let's just project a little question, and that is, if you're driving up there in Minnesota and it's really cold, take it down to whatever you want, and you're driving down the highway, and just ask yourself, are you leaving a streamer down the road as you're driving a mile or 2 miles or 10 miles? Is there like a stream following you? No, there's not. And it's the same reason. It's the same reason, okay? You have mixing and dissipation that will take place. If it's water. If it's water, right? Okay, now let's look at a cloud a little bit. A cloud is interesting in terms of what I see are two main, and more recently even a third one, factor that's important. Number one, you have to have moisture, okay? But here's the one that gets really interesting to me. You have to have a particle, a solid particle, for a cloud to form. And they're called cloud nuclei. They are incredibly small. We're talking up to submicron range. Oh, let's get the size thing out of the way, too, so you have a sense of scale, because I'll be using that term micron probably quite a bit. Your human hair is about 60 to 100 microns thick. Okay? The size that I'm talking about for these cloud nuclei, they're submicron. Okay, clouds need solid particles for that water to adhere to, and the cloud won't exist without it. So therefore, that's telling you that a cloud is not forming in perfectly clean, dry air, right? It's actually saying sort of the opposite. Needs moisture, needs particles. So the first thing to understand here is that these physical principles are entirely different from one another. These are not the same thing. And part of the dirty water that has come in here on this issue is the blending of these two issues and mixing of the language so that we can no longer make this distinction. Most people are not making that distinction in their mind. They're saying, oh, a trail coming from an airplane, it's forming a cloud. Okay? Well, those don't fit in terms of definition. Now, there will be a way it can work, and I'll try to explain that way to you. There is a way it can work, but it requires a modification of that environment. And the last one is just more recently that I ran into. I'm sort of a book hound. But so there's this book at the bookstore the other day, and it's called How to Fossilize Your Hamster. Okay? And this guy, there's a series, a couple of books out there. So I'm not even getting through the pictures, right? But, so he's written 2 books. And I'm reading through this one, and he starts talking about cloud formation. You know, and of course, I'm always trying to learn. And this guy added another dimension that I hadn't really even considered, which is really pretty neat. Because every one of us can start testing what I'm talking about if you care. Everything I do is open. There's nothing about this being just in my domain. And the guy says, hey, you want to make a cloud? Here's how you do it. So guess what he does? He gets a liter bottle of water, one of those little water bottle guys, right? Puts a little bit of water in it. And he drops a match in the water. Okay? And then he says, squeeze the bottle. And watch what happens. And basically he's saying, I'm making a cloud chamber. Now, these things can get sort of advanced. Cloud chambers can be more advanced physics type thing, but he's giving us a way where we can relate to this on a more elementary and simple level. And what happens is the pressure causes, in this container, you will see a cloud form and disappear depending on the pressure in the bottle. Okay? So pressure is another variable. But the real thing that I want to stress here in this interesting additional analogy this person gave me was the reason that you had that cloud form in that bottle was why? The smoke. The smoke was a source of particles. You remember what I just described, right? It can't be clean to have that cloud. What a great example it is. One time I did some work, this is just a side, but I did some work with a method called electrostatic precipitation. And it's where you take a chamber, and you subject it a high voltage in there, like Van de Graaff generators. Some of you may know those, but it generates high voltage. Anyway, you make this chamber and you drive in high voltage. And what I did, this was one of my first occasions where I was experimenting with this idea, but I filled this up with smoke, and you run this voltage in, it's incredible what happens. That smoke will swirl around and immediately collect on the sides of the container. It's a way of cleaning. Commercial places, commercial factories use it to clean It's like an alternative to a HEPA filter. Okay. Well, that's the point I'm trying to make here. Is that smoke? It's a solid material. Even though it might be hard for you to get your hands on it, it's a solid material, and you can get your hands on it if you care enough about it. Okay. Now that we have that definition of two basic, completely different physical principles, and it's really helpful and important to me to separate those. Because now we have to project a certain scenario coming out. And that is to start explaining what we see. Now, if I have an aircraft, or your car driving down Michigan, or anything which is emitting this supposedly vapor, right? But now it is leaving the 2-mile trail on the ground, or 500 mile. You can see 250 each way. I've done the whole thing. 500 miles across with an aircraft, and it's not dissipating, and it's not mixing. And in fact, not only that, it is extending itself to form eventually a sort of a layer of material. What is happening under those circumstances? How could that happen? It does not fit conventional physics with water vapor. Not by my best analysis. Again, I offer what I do. I've done, the work. It's all there. You can look at my chemistry models of what I've done on this and the amount of time it takes and humidity influence. It just doesn't fit normal physics. But how can it? How can you come up with an explanation for that circumstance? And here's a way, especially if you put together what we've already talked about. If that material that's coming out of that machine is persisting, I'm not using the term persistent continuum, but if it's persisting, what could cause that? Here's what could cause that. If there was a source of nuclei, remember the thing about cloud nuclei? If there was a source of nuclei within that emission, and furthermore, if those nuclei were attracted to water, there's a word called hygroscopic, something that draws water, a desiccant. If it were both of those things, small enough, and especially if it loved water, it fits. That circumstance will occur under those conditions. And this is a physical basis of my entire argument to you, that a primary reason that transformation of the atmosphere can take place is with the introduction of a submicron, in particular metallic salt. That will be something for you to digest. It didn't come quickly to me, but that is the logical conclusion that I've reached of a physical basis that does explain the situation that has been observed. And now consider the fragility of the atmosphere that we talked about. Because another question that comes up on this is, you see this, you say, well, how much impact can that have? Okay, yeah, I mean, it's an airplane. Okay, and when I first started observing this 12 years ago, I'm thinking, it's just a machine. I don't know how big an impact it would be. But over the years, I've actually studied that a little bit. And the question I had in my mind, is it actually possible to consider transforming the atmosphere? Not just influencing it, okay? Not just injecting something, but would it actually be possible to physically transform that environment, that shell of the atmosphere? My answer is yes. It is possible. I've done the work to try and create a logistical situation in terms of, logistics. How much time is it possible to do? My conclusion is that yes, it is possible. And when I say my conclusion, that's based on an analysis or logic. We also have other tools available to us. Because I will make a claim to you at this point. It's not a matter of not only can it occur from a logical and logistical standpoint, but it has happened. It has been done. Another claim that I will make to you is that the atmosphere of this planet has been transformed. I say it's done. It's in place. It's not a question of is it going to be. And in fact, in terms of what we talk about, the reason I'm going to progress to that biological side is because there's some other things going on that have become fairly serious. And, you know, it takes time, and it's a process, and you will have to decide whether or not you want to take the time in your life to become educated or knowledgeable in these processes. Okay? But I'm not at the point right now in my life where I'm trying to settle could she or couldn't she. Okay? I have to accept certain things. And I have to accept that this planet has been changed. And now I have to go on, because I made my calling. I made my calling. It's not just me. And there's a big point of this talk about it wasn't just me. The population did scream. Okay? You guys in general, the population did holler. They did their job. And they said, something is wrong here. And they called for their investigation. And petitions were signed. All the processes were gone through for several years in a row. That's a little bit of what this is about in part. This is a list, a partial list of when I started doing my research. I'm a fairly innocuous, quiet guy. I'm a former federal employee, technical kind of guy, not really particularly pro, I'm not like a big scene guy. But I do my research. And yes, this was certainly a crucial point in my life when I decided, I'm not a journalist, but the platform of the internet gives me the medium to present information that I believe to be a substance to the world. And I felt compelled to do that. And when I started doing my research, I'm just this little guy in my RV at that time when I moved to Santa Fe. And I'm putting up photographs. All I'm doing is I'm just recording. I don't think I'm even particularly trying to draw too much of an inference or conclusion at this point. I'm just taking photographs and I'm saying, something looks funny here. Okay? Well, this is a partial list of the types of organizations and agencies, institutions that expressed an interest in my work. Would be a very nice way of saying it. Okay? And if you look at this list, you will find represented the holy grail of sophistication in terms of military, chemical, intelligence, medical, corporate, government, technology. You will find that embodied in this list. And here was the split that started to happen. I'm doing the research. I did this for about, 3 months, 5 months, something like that. I did this, and I did it to make a point. I stopped after a while. In fact, you can't get this kind of information now. They've changed things. But at this time, you could get this kind of information. But I'm doing research, which is presenting this. I see this happening behind the scenes, right? And I have to make that known because it seems to be relevant. It just seems to be relevant. I'm not out making a scene, but obviously the scene. Who has an interest in this work? I didn't ask for the interest. I didn't call. I just posted it. Okay, so that's happening. Well, what's happening on the other side? In the public forum, the government officials, the military, what are they saying? They're saying this is a hoax. This is a joke, man. Aircraft, to quote spraying. I'm going to take questions afterwards. You had an inconsistency there between how the public was responded to, even when all sincerity was put forth in terms of putting forth information and calling for an investigation, how they were treated versus what was being said. Let's go through a couple of these. Maybe I can catch up on some of these. These are now letters that come in, right? And maybe hard to read. I'll read just a sentence. This is coming from political officials. Okay, you get things from Congress is all in there. The term this is from Mark Green. I assume he's a senator. The term chemtrail is a hoax, right? That began circulating approximately 3 years ago. Okay, so it was characterized as a hoax. Now, what's a hoax? It's a purposeful intent to deceive someone, right? To play a prank. Well, I can only say as a person, I really don't have the time or interest in my life. I don't. It's not just me. But I don't have any desire to play hoaxes on people. It certainly wasn't real on my side. So there was this big inconsistency that developed. And we can't see the time there anymore. There are many, many interesting twists and stories that can be told forever about this lab situation, certain responses. This is an interesting one. And every picture to me will tell a story, and I'll never get through all my pictures. I probably have about 80 pictures here today, right? And I made it through 2. Okay? But I'll do the best I can. But they're all interesting to me. If you look at these letters that are signed, this is one of the guys signing them, Michael Gibson. Okay? There's a colonel and lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. But this is a hoax. Public representation policy of this issue to the public. It's a joke, man. Okay, it took about 5 years, 6 years later, completely silent. Nobody remembered this guy at all. Okay? I found a reference to this guy about 6 years after all these letters came out from him. And guess who this guy was? Gibson is a master intelligence officer in the Air Force. This is the guy that signed these. Okay? Now, again, it's interesting to me, right? But what's the I'm not such a person, but what would be the function of a master intelligence officer? It is to shape, manipulate, convey information, and collect and gather too, right? But it works both ways. Propagandize comes out. It is to shape and manipulate that information in a way to produce a desired effect and consequence. My interpretation. You don't have to agree with it. That's my interpretation of one of the primary functions of an intelligence officer. That's who was behind this. Now, at the time, this was never known. And like I say, this is not something most people even picked up on at all. These kind of things are interesting in indicating the level of incongruity between the public presentations that were made and the displayed interest behind the scenes. Let's push through. These are the public responses that come in. A portion of them, not the whole thing. My job here is to act as a pooling place for those that are willing to take the time and effort to write to the officials, to play to do the proper things and to play the game the right way and write your letters and petitions and all this type of stuff. And for me to say, this is simply what happened when these people did this. Okay? The pattern is quite clear. The issue was to be dismissed. The issue was never given credible treatment by any of these agencies. And the EPA becomes particularly interesting in here with regard to a physical sample that was done. Look at our, even those that we think are supposedly acting in our interest and benefit, right? Greenpeace can't help. A lot of the notions we have, I'm sorry, they get blown out eventually. Greenpeace didn't do anything. Their statement, I don't know if that'll show up here, but they'll say something to the effect of, Greenpeace only works with global issues. We don't really handle things like this. Okay? It's all in there. It's all in there. Now, so a disappointment is what I'm having to express to you. A disappointment in terms of that energy that people put forth to simply call attention to that which they knew was wrong. And to have that dismissal in their lives is a hard thing to bear for all of us. But it's a reality, so now we have to carry on. We have to carry on. Now, these may be hard for you to see, and this was difficult, okay, in terms of photography. I didn't have, I'm a jury rigger. Everything I do is pretty much jury rigged, whatever I can round up. And this is a regular camera where I'm stacking up teleconverters on teleconverters on teleconverters, and, for $100 trying to simulate a $5,000 camera. So the images will be darker sometimes, but the fact is the information is there the best I can if you look at this. And there's some interesting situations that come up. These photographs I'm showing right now, I would not characterize to you as being representative of the primary aspect of the phenomenon. One thing that has been observed over the years is that it appears as though different dissemination or distribution systems for the particulates have been used. It's not like we could. There's a lot of questions about that. People even get in their own particular stance that they have to defend. I don't have that. I see a lot of possibilities there. But these were interesting in that they once again had a break with logic and physics, because these are a set of photographs that they should start to make us ask some questions. And what happens here, if you look at these, you'll find some cases here where you have a dissemination of material occurring from wingspan to wingspan across the entire stretch. The word that I would use is laminar, and laminar flow, a sheet flow. A sheet flow of material coming out. But what happens when I look at the plane? Well, first of all, this particular plane, now hard for you to see, I've seen it, so it's not fair to me, but the engines of this aircraft are on the fuselage. These engines are not even on the wings. Okay? I think it's MD-80, I think. People know more in the aviation than I do, but nevertheless, there's a class of aircraft that have the engines on the wing. You have a physical problem here, and that I have this emission of materials coming about. It's not entirely an isolated case. I'm not saying it's representative either, but it's not entirely isolated. That is physically impossible for that material to be coming from those engines in that case. Okay? Now, I am familiar, at least I try to be fair, with, let's call it dissenting arguments. There is one here that comes up on what you call vortex on wings. All I can say is, one of the first things I do, if there's ever a question, is I try to legitimately and fairly study the opposing perspective and give that a credence and attention it deserves. I can only say I've done that for this. It doesn't work again. Again, we'd have to dig into the papers and the work, but it doesn't suffice. You know, it doesn't. Another time, if you want to get into that stuff, I will. These are progression photographs. This is I didn't take these. This is somebody in Albuquerque that set up their camera all day long and just said, "Hey, this is what I see." Certainly, what we can say at the very least is that we witness a progression here where a transformation of the atmosphere has taken place and appears to be as a direct influence of aircraft activity. How's that for a mouthload? But I think that's a fair statement. And progression photos can be very interesting, or time-lapse, because you see things in a way that you don't. This guy is white. Okay, so I'm going to try to punch through these. This is a part of the... I apply myself. If you give me a problem and I think it's important, I apply myself to it. I didn't have much of the research done here is original research. It simply doesn't exist. And I would simply apply myself the best I can. And I did the work on the physics and chemistry. That probably occupied, you have probably a couple years of mostly photography. I'm just taking images and documenting. Then I'm starting to get into the mechanics and physics of what's going on and to start saying, hey, what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. And so I have to develop models. I mean, my background is in math and such, so I develop models. So I try to explain things. These things didn't exist. They don't exist because it's sort of interesting, but contrail formation is not exactly the type of thing you want people to know about. The formation of those actually has some security implications in terms of aircraft. I tried to find public available models on contrail formation. Hey, let's just get it out there if it's already done. I don't want to have to create things from scratch if I don't need to. I looked, there wasn't anything. The only one I found was some guy back in the 50s, okay? What's called a nomograph, which is a graphical view. It wasn't even an analytical presentation. It was a graphical form written in the 50s. It's the best I could come up with. So I had to do my own work in terms of asking what's logical and what's not. So that's what these are all about. It demonstrates that work that's going on in the background for at least 2 to 3 years. Discontinuities and breaks. I know the counter-arguments. I'm not going to go into this level of detail now. But from a logical standpoint, there's some questions that this raises. When you have a break in something, okay? I know it's a fluid medium and all that, but you don't have that severity of that break there. One of the interesting things about this photograph was that when I put it up there, let's just say I had a very concerted effort made to me to try to find out very much the particulars and details of that photograph. Meaning, they wanted time and date and place and orientation and the whole thing. Again, my own interpretation, I could be wrong, but it appeared in this case they had a special interest in that pilot. And they wanted to know that specific flight so that this could be identified. Because this is not particularly advantageous to your cause of, let's say, obscurity of presentation. And in addition, neither are those planes with the full wingspan flow. Those aren't particularly beneficial towards a case of minimalist presentation. And we can say it's interesting or it's curious, I don't know, but we can also say that after I started putting up those photographs of this style, let's just say I was not able to collect any more of those particular types of photographs. Some people have, but I never have. I would measure, people say these aircraft, hey, they're flying at 5,000, 3,000 feet, they're flying right over my head. I'm sorry, from my side, not the case. I measured the altitude of these planes photogrammetrically. Not a single plane was less than 35,000 feet over my head anywhere that I took a photograph. And that's why the imagery is difficult to collect. You can't get the kind of detail that you might like. Santa Fe, New Mexico, is it April 14th, 2008? I don't know. Mountains of Santa Fe. I call a tower on this one, I had my little gung-ho too, for a while, and I called the tower on this one. I don't do that kind of stuff that often. It was just an interesting exchange a little bit. I said, the airport there in Santa Fe is probably about 5 miles from where I lived, and I called him and I just said, you see what's going on over those mountains there? And there was this really uncomfortable pause. That's all I can say in a conversation. It was like, when you're talking to someone and it's just too long for their response. This is the way it was. It was like 10 to 15 seconds, just a dead time. And then he comes back and says, what do you mean? Okay. And I say, well, what's going on over there it's not normal. And then you have a little more uncomfortable pause, but not quite as long. Okay, it's the first time. And he says, what do you mean? Everything's fine to me. This was that type of exchange, and they're just representative of the wall that people ran into, over and over and over, and difficult to accommodate. Okay, if you look closely, you can see the atmosphere is a fluid environment. Right? Moisture, if it's released in an even sense, would be expected to be evenly distributed and dissipate uniformly as well in a fluid medium. Right? Well, I called them core lines, but the first time I saw this, some interesting things going on. That within the emissions was a centralized, or I call them core lines, of focused material of some kind. I can only say it doesn't, to me, satisfy the expectation of water vapor release. And you remember my whole point before, that if I have persistence under these conditions, that I've already got a problem with water vapor alone. But in this case, now I have questions about concentration of material coming in also. How am I doing on that time business I was talking about?
3:25.
When did I want to quit? 3:30 on this first part? Okay. I wonder how many more I have. Well, I guess we can take a break and see how many more I have. This photograph is up here simply to say, we might have some questions that we want to be asking here. I didn't take this photograph, but it was given to me. I direct source from that person. I know who it was given. He gave it to me directly. He's the original. It's interesting. That's all I can say. In this case, I don't know exactly what it means, but you had a ring. You have a ring here, and then you have this equivalent laminar flow occurring the diameter of that ring. Now, I don't know what it means. I can't give you all the answers. I'm just saying when I see this, it causes me to ask some questions. Okay? The assumptions that we make about what is happening and what is real are subject to challenge, at least, in a situation like this. Right? Even the notion of aircraft can at least be questioned here. What am I really dealing with here? Another question that I have in terms of logic is if I want to hide something, I don't put a laminar flow behind it. So if we're trying to judge, quote, intent, what would be the intent of a manifestation where you have a full laminar flow in a ring? There's certainly nothing about secrecy here. They're just interesting questions, and this is made to simply say, how do we know what those boundaries actually are? And the deeper we get into this issue, the farther those boundaries seem to go. And you will have to ask yourself, how far are you willing to go to encompass the range of information which is available to you? Now, okay, so let me see if I can, let's see, I think I know how to go back to, let's see if we can, probably two, to me it's all important, but I have to be respectful of your time. I'm trying to see how I could summarize. I'm going to use this one for right now. This is really summarizing, like I said. This is a list that I have developed over the past dozen years of what I call applications. I call them areas of endeavor. People will always say, why are they doing this? Okay. What are they doing? I don't have the inside track on what I perceive probably to be the grandest global covert operation in the history of mankind. I don't have an inside track. But I do have my mind, and I do the best I can with it. And this is a list that has evolved very slowly with a lot of work. Each one of these usually represents a couple years behind it. But I describe them as an application or an area of endeavor, meaning that such an operation of this nature could be conducted, and that type of operation is consistent with all of the data that has accumulated over the period of time. That's a difficult condition to put on something, and that's why the list has been so slow in evolving, because it's not okay for me to have one of these if it doesn't work with the others. So these if people ask me why, I simply say these are applications. These are areas that are consistent with all of the data. And I'll go over them because it'll be the summary of probably this whole section that I'll never get through. And every one of these we could talk at least for a whole day on, I'm sure. And I could be engaged. I don't know if you could or not, but I could be totally engaged in these because there's a couple years behind it. I could certainly occupy a day or a week of my life trying to convey that to you. What I get to do here today is simply itemize the list so that we are at least aware of that list, right? We get it on a record. And then you now have a pathway where you and others might be able to save years of work to pursue those pathways if you felt they were important to you or society as a whole. So here's the list. Environmental modification. There are many individuals that will take a single one of these and they will simply claim that this is what it's about. I can't do that. I can't exclude any of them. It could be any combination, 1, 2, all 7, but they're all consistent to me, but I certainly can't take one. There are some folks that will say this particular operation has all to do with global warming and we're fixing things for you, but we're not going to tell you about it. And I have a problem with that. Okay? I have a problem with it. But there's plenty of people that advocate that point of view. I don't. The evidence to me indicates quite the contrary, that these particular materials have actually accelerated and aggravated the situation of global warming, not mitigated it. This would be my conclusion from a physical and chemistry side. So the first topic here is environmental modification. This means, do these materials have the ability to modify the general environment of the planet and the atmosphere? And the answer is yes, and we could take our day and go over that, but my conclusion is yes, they do and they can. Military applications. there's crossover between these. We certainly saw the interest in the military, but what are the... we didn't even talk about this yet, but I've got to get this in. I've got to get it in, I guess. We talked about the hypothesis or supposition that if you introduce a metallic salt into the atmosphere at a fine enough level, that it could explain the physical dimensions of what we're seeing, right? We talked about that. Okay, now let's go a little bit deeper on that one. That particular class of metallic salts that I have identified to the best of my ability, again, I don't have all the means and measures, but I have done work to try and identify. If I'm saying they're metallic salts, is there any way I can figure out what kind of metallic salts are? Why did I say they were metallic salts? Well, because of the water absorption. Okay. By the way, half the periodic table is metals, so metals in themselves are not unusual. I'm not talking about metals in a pure form. I'm talking about salts. My goodness, your table salt is a metallic salt. Okay, sodium chloride, right? Metallic salts come in many, many forms, very, very common sometimes. But the properties of water absorption is one of them. Now, here's the property of these salts that I have found to be a basis of a further supposition that I have made. There is a particular class of metallic salts that if you subject them to energy, they ionize. Now, what does that mean? An ion is a charged particle. Okay? And hey, if I ever do anything that's not right to understand, you got to let me know, because the whole purpose of this is for us to understand. So if you think I will not try to lead you, and I try to talk in terms I can understand. But an ion is a charged particle. Okay? Got juice to it. Little bitty guy. It's got some oomph and juice to it. Right? If I subject a particular class of metallic salts to energy, they become electrically charged. Gets really interesting here. Okay, what kind of energy do I need? The particular class of metallic salts that I am speaking of here, sunlight alone is sufficient to ionize them. This is actually fascinating to me. When I started out in this, I had no idea that such a thing could happen. Okay? You mean to tell me you can take the energy of just what's beaming down on us, and you can subject a particular class of material to that energy, and that it will become electrically charged? It's like, wow. But this is true. This is true. This can happen. Now, some people made a mockery of this when I presented this statement, okay? But it's okay with me, because in the end, you have to simply drive to the truth the best you can wherever it was. And the mockery of this would be, oh, Carnicom, he's saying if he says some table salt out on the deck that it's going to suddenly become electric charge. Okay? Well, not exactly, okay, but in principle, this person was making a joke out of something that's actually quite real, if you look at it. And one of the ways this can come about is like the ocean has magnesium salts, okay? And they sort of vaporize off the ocean. That is one of those classes that can happen. Now, the particular element that has been of the greatest interest to me here is one called barium. And I will say that early in the research, this is a case where you're given a lead. I was actually given a piece of information that said barium is involved in this, okay? Early in the game. That information, literally, it just sat for 2 years. Sometimes I can't do anything with it. I couldn't do anything with that piece of information. I didn't know anything particularly about barium. I had no understanding of it. It's like several years later, at least 2 or 3, I'm doing some work, and I'm starting to do some testing, and I'm starting to see the indication physically of something that's starting to catch my interest, that's satisfying properties of barium, a barium metallic salt. And eventually that became positive as best I can. You can go through the work, but I have here is plasma. The cosmos are primarily plasma. The Earth, or a planet, is an anomaly. To have something of this form, this is an anomaly in the grand scheme of things. So most of this universe, as we would know it, is of plasma. So plasma now becomes like, it's a bit important, right? It's not the little guy here. And the simplest example I can give you of what does this mean in real life effects would be a neon light tube. Most of us are familiar with the neon light tube. And what is happening there? You have this tube, and it's filled with gas, right? There's no wire. There's no wire. It's this tube, and what happens? You subject it to energy, and it lights up. That gas is conducting that energy without a physical medium other than the plasma or electrically charged gas itself. I have this Van de Graaff generator. This thing generates high voltage. It's one of those fun things you play around with. But you put your hand on it, it's generating high voltage, and you hold this neon light tube, right, and it's lighting up on you. No wires. Okay. So the grand picture that comes out of this is the real consideration, not just an idea, but the real consideration that the atmosphere can, and apparently is in the process, and now has been altered to the point where it has become an electrically conductive medium. More so by far than nature. The ionosphere, many of us have heard of the ionosphere, which is a charged layer. It's how ham radio got started, and all the first radio, bouncing off top. It's this layer like 60 to 100 miles above us, that it is an electrically charged layer. And that is responsible for the propagation. The first time we discovered that you could send energy all the way across the continents was by bouncing off this ionosphere, right? Well, the fascinating thing to me was, there's a statement there somewhere to this effect, but gosh, I only made it through number one. This ionosphere, 3% of the mass of this ionosphere is electrically charged. In other words, just a little bitty portion of it is electrically charged. But it totally changes the physical properties of that medium. The point here is it doesn't take much to cause an entire change once you have the ability to start having electrons in there. See, the air by itself is this excellent insulator. If it was pure, it has almost no electrons in it. It doesn't conduct electricity at all. But if you can just, it's called electron density, but if you can increase that electron density at all through any means, you get to change everything in terms of the way the game is played of sending energy from point A to point B. That's what this is all about. And what's happening here is I'm talking about 1, 2, and 3 a little bit all at the same time. Okay? There are applications here between all of these things. Now when you're dealing with the ability to send energy, it changes things. And weapon systems have to come into consideration. They just do. Okay, I'm going to hold off on this because I'm going to go to that last section, which we're getting to eventually. We're going to be focusing on this. And these these are not discussed in detail as much in my work over the years. This one does have some. There's quite a bit there on magnetics. The question that's coming up there, is it actually possible where the planet as a whole could actually be affected, the geophysics of the planet be affected? And it sounds a little bit far out when you first get involved in it, involving rotational rates and magnetic fields of the Earth and this type of thing. All I can say is there's a body of work there that says that, yeah, it actually seems possible that we could actually be dealing with things at a planetary level that could be causing change by the environment. It has to do with the ability to store information. I'll give you this picture because it helps me. And, you know, the HARP thing ties in. And I shouldn't say HARP without saying what it is, so holler at me. But, you know, HARP is an ionospheric, quote, ionospheric research station through the Air Force. It's a facility which is specifically dedicated, at least in theory, towards the study, right, and scientific research of propagation of energy in an electrically charged medium. That's what it's about. Okay, to give you a sense, like this planetary thing is not, this is not far-fetched, what I'm leading to. If you read this patent by a guy named Bernard Eastland, he was the author. You see, on the patent, it won't say the word HARP. This patent by Eastland, I would consider as the blueprint. It appears to be the blueprint for the development of HARP. But Bernard Eastland develops this patent that describes the methods of the HARP technology. And over time, I've made the effort to read that thing in detail. It started out being a lot of, all the stuff that people don't like to read. But I took the time to do it over the years, and the more I read that thing, the more fascinating it became, because that patent in many ways captured the very essence of these things that I'm talking about to you. Four out of it, even 5, even this one, 5 of these things, maybe even 6, are actually embodied within that patent if you start to read this thing. Well, here's one that really sort of caught my attention. And there's many of them. This is one example. And the point here was, is it possible that we could be dealing with planetary effects? Okay, he mentioned this thing called a heave weapon, H-E-A-V-E. Okay, and I say, what the heck is a heave weapon? And what it is, a heave weapon is when you use a magnetic field of the Earth and you build up energy. Okay, there's something called ELF. Extremely low frequency waves. We have this radio spectrum and lots of parts to it. ELF means really, really, really long waves. Okay, and they have all kinds of implications with respect to even our bodies, because our brains work. We function in those ELF ranges. Okay, so the patent, the Eastland patent, will talk about these ELF waves and such. And so he starts talking about this heave weapon, and to learn what it is, well, you build up energy, and in my mind I can see it. I mean, I've never seen it described or beyond this or pictured, but in my mind I can see it because I've gone through the math of this energy buildup. But if you take these low frequency waves and you work on resonance, and you keep building and building and building this energy, you're talking about something that's grand scale, okay, literally the size of the Earth. If you do this enough, the heave weapon is described as a weapon that lifts up the magnetic field of the Earth and shoves it back down. It's like this. The magnetic field of the Earth, okay, to lift it and slam it down. And how is it described? It's described as a weapon that has all the power, literally, I mean like numerically, all the power of an atomic weapon, but no bomb. Okay? This is the level of which things are described at. Okay? And on my side, I did work to figure out this energy. Is it actually possible to do this? And you'll see the work, but this is where this came from. That yes, it looks like it's actually possible. Now, obviously, Eastland, he had something figured out, but I had to go on the backside and try to say, well, with what I'm dealing here, does it make sense and all that? And my conclusion was, yeah, I got to be considering these things. Okay, we're going to punch, I think, through the rest of these. This is a global warming model. Okay. And now we're going to start working into that second section. How are we doing on how much have we used versus
3:45.
how much time have we gone, do you think? Roughly. If you don't care, it's okay with me. I don't care, but
An
hour and 15 minutes or something? What's that?
About an hour and 15.
Hour and 15. And I was supposed to go an hour and a half total, and I haven't even gotten to the second section yet. Okay, so there's this. We're going to start bridging now, and I'm thinking we'll take. It depends if you can last long enough. Take a break after I'm done for then questions. But if you want to take a break, you know, if you need or want that, I could do it also because this next section is like the other half of what I was going to cover today. What do you guys want to do? You want to keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's go. And this is like another. I've never done this section before at the depth that I hope to get through it. And it's probably equal in substance easily to what we've done. Okay, now we're, you know that topic I had there, this one, biological? Well, not to diminish these. Again, these are all on equal standing. But this one over the years took on special interest, I guess, is how I would say it. Because it starts really early. If we dig up the chronology, I started this work in '98. We're going to see my first paper coming out in 2001, I think, on this. Oh, and actually, there's a segment even before that, almost from the very beginning. Let's talk about a physical material with the EPA for a little bit. You had the appearance of in addition to testing I was doing for particulate matter, you had the presence of a filament type material that was showing up in the environment. People were seeing this unusual type of filament showing up. And that's a whole story in itself. Eventually, that was sent to the EPA. I sent it along with a colleague of mine, Dave Peterson. We sent it by certified letter. The material, I studied it a great deal. There's whole papers on it. I can only say the material was of sufficient interest that I believe, on behalf of the public welfare, that this material deserved identification. This is what I would say. And Dave and I were both strongly compelled enough to write the EPA with a certified letter and send this material to them formally and ask them. I think it was a reasonable letter. I don't think it was anything mean. It just said, please identify this on behalf of the public welfare. Okay? And this is a whole saga in itself. But what happens is, one thing that's curious about this, when the EPA receives this letter, we get a certified mail thing, right? They write us a letter back. There's no acknowledgement of the physical sample in their letter. The correspondence, I mean, part of it, you would think a logical thing is at least reference receipt of the material, right? There was no acknowledgement that the physical material was there. They just, and their letters, if we get into their letters, the correspondence will be coming back with a certain phrase showing up over and over and over, and is saying the EPA is not aware. This is the phrase they use. They say, we are not aware basically any aircraft operations that we regard as being unusual. But it was an interesting phrase. It was always, we are not aware. Sort of like Reagan had the time of I don't remember, sort of a key phrase in terms of history, in terms of a strategy being used. But this was the one that was chosen, was not aware. Now, what was interesting to me was, I and others, we were making them aware. But they still weren't aware after we'd make them aware. And that's a break in logic to me, too. And this happened over and over. We got 2 or 3 letters, always back the same phrase, we are not aware. Well, but that was the whole point of writing a letter. Right? Okay, so they never acknowledged physical receipt of this material the whole time. A year to a year and a half transpires. And still the same situation, just the same level of correspondence. About a year and a couple months into it, you have a person who actually, it appears as though the people behind this did not believe that the original correspondence and such had taken place the way it was being described. It appears as though that the original correspondence was being challenged. So they submitted a Freedom of Information Act. Back when we had a Freedom of Information Act. Remember that? They submitted a Freedom of Information Act about this particular letter. And nothing could happen that had happened up to this point at all. But when this FOIA had been submitted, suddenly we got a receipt back from the EPA. And what they did was they sent the material back to us. And we could find the phrase. The phrase is really, really curious to me. But they now wrote back and they said, it is not the policy of the EPA to identify or analyze any unsolicited material. This was their response. After a year and a half, as a response to a FOIA. Flags, right? Flags are going up. So they didn't do anything, but it took them a year and a half to tell me that they weren't doing anything. Okay. Well, there's a lot of things that were transpiring in the background of this. Gosh, I wish I had time to tell you stories, but there were things going on in the background over this year and a half that some people, they still don't have any idea of, okay? But one of them was that I had been invited down to Albuquerque to a doctor's office, and I simply can't identify him. I can tell you that he is a high caliber professional, extremely knowledgeable in advanced microscopy. I can say that. Okay, he invites me down there, and the correspondence started out, Clifford, I'm seeing some things that you can't see with your microscope. Okay, and my work, if you look at it, was all about analyzing it with I started out with $30 toy microscope. That's how I started out. Okay, I'm taking pictures with my camera, and I'm studying these things, and I'm subjecting them to chemical tests. I'm learning about them the best I can. And they were already very, very interesting to me, just with what I was learning, in terms of their chemical and physical and tactile properties and this type of thing. So this guy is saying, I see some things that you can't see with yours. So I go down there, and he shows me what he sees. And he's starting to see a biological structure within these filaments. And this is not me. This is what he told me. Because it's like, I'm not assuming anything. I'm just there to learn. he says, I'm seeing red blood cells. Okay? Now, this was a little bit strange to me at that time, because there was no indication of, first of all, I couldn't see anything of biological nature at all. I just didn't have the equipment for it. But in particular, I'm like, this guy's a professional medical, and he's telling me he's seeing red blood cells. Okay? And then, this is a little bit curious on the side, but he steps out of the office for a little bit, and I'm looking in the scope. You know, he sort of says, go ahead and look. And I'm looking through there, and I see some things that he had never seen when he was looking. And I'm seeing like clumps. I found it looks like a grape cluster. We can go through all this stuff. But like he was seeing individual cells, and I found two of these things in the time I was looking. They were like clusters of things. Well, the point here is that we have this scenario where the EPA is being called upon to do something in the public interest. And well, I'm too nice sometimes, but they were hesitant, right? They were hesitant. You have me who's calling attention that these particular filaments, these seem to be of great interest to me, because I'm learning about, you know, asbestos fibers are about 2 microns in thickness. You remember the hair thing, right? Okay. We all know the environmental attention that has been paid to asbestos fibers, right? Where I worked, they had these guys come in suits one day and didn't tell anybody, okay, cleaning out asbestos. It's like, we know it's sort of bad news, and even in the whole public scene with regard to asbestos fibers, right? 2 microns. I'm a measurer. I was a surveyor. I'm a measurer. I always want to know how big things are. So in my work, even with my limited means, I'm trying to figure out what is the size of these filaments. I end up, after a concerted effort, with the conclusion that these materials are at the sub-micron range in thickness. Okay? From my work, I can tell like they're 1 micron or less. Okay? It's like significant, because if I have some source of an environmental fibrous material that is measuring even less than asbestos, and it's not being identified, it's like something is inappropriate here. And then in addition, you now have this guy down there saying, I'm seeing some biological things in there. And not only that, I'm particularly seeing a red blood cell, which starts to blow people's minds. First of all, if you just say the name, it starts to, cause all kinds of jitters in most of us. And I left with that information. Okay? And just like the barium kind of thing, I sort of sat on it for 2 years. Didn't mean I sat. Can you actively sit on something? I couldn't do anything with it for another 2 years, or whatever it is. But then you'll find work where I start getting into air sampling. Remember I talked about the electrostatic precipitation? Purpose is to collect very fine particles. I put glass slides on there and put them on the scope. Anyway, I started getting things down where I could capture things from the air very small with what's called HEPA filters, or this method of electrostatic precipitation. And I start getting samples, and I start looking at these samples. And I start to see some. This is probably, I'm guessing, a year and a half. I see my first paper was in 2001, it looks like. And he would have had me there within the first year, 1999. But I start seeing structures. And like, we clear the air by, I'm not a doctor. I offer no medical advice, no diagnosis of any kind on anything that I say today. And I am acting only as you'll see this qualifier in all my papers. I'm acting only as a independent researcher, providing information on what I regard as significant biological findings. Okay? Nothing medical at all, no matter what I say today, right? Can't take anything out of it medical. I'm not a doctor, and no diagnosis, no prescription. But I start seeing structures that I'm starting to be able to come to no other conclusion. I'm trying hard, I'm trying really hard, but I can't come to any other conclusion in that they look like red blood cells. And this is like, there's this link now going on with this. My work, I do things over and over and over the best I can. I try to be fair and honest in what I do. And I did not want to jump onto this issue and make a big scene. I really didn't. But I had to report what I saw when I did the test enough over and over and over to my satisfaction that I was seeing something, that I now started to collaborate and be consistent with other information. And I started writing my first papers. You'll see this way back in 2001. I'm starting to put up these papers, and it's like I try to be the most fair I can. I'll say positive visual identification. Okay, the first one will start out with question marks, and every time I do it, it gets a little bit stronger the more that I measure them. And I eventually come to the point where, from a visual standpoint and a metric standpoint, and again, qualifying myself as not being a doctor, that the best assessment that I can make is that these structures appear to be a form of a blood cell. And the detractors on this league, well, I remember when those came out, this created some heat. This is not something that people want to take lightly. And I had stories of the fish meal factories in New Mexico, of which there were none, in my area where I was living, somehow releasing blood cells into there. Anyway, there are a series of detractor arguments that will be, and again, I'll always look at those, but they didn't work. Okay? It wasn't reasonable at all. And so this opened up an issue very slowly over the years that I've been very reluctant to advocate more than is absolutely justified with a great deal of body. If you see some of these papers, I really tone things down. I mean, I have this one. I don't know if it's there. It gets to the point where I put up this article, and it's called "Extraordinary Biological Observations," and I wrote about one paragraph on it. It's like I didn't want to say too much, but I had to say something. And what it was about, let's see if we can, I'm going to try and push into those.
This is what the art world is doing.
Pardon me?
What the art world is doing.
The art world?
Yeah, they're massaging that information. It's filtering through.
And when we do finish today, I don't have that. I want to get to it. Well, nevertheless. What happens is, I'm starting to play with cultures. I'm starting to collect these air samples, and I'm starting to create a culture dish, a medium where you try to grow things. Everything I do is jury-rigged with the equipment. I mean, I do it proper the best I can, but I don't have like a formal lab. I just do the best I can. But I started getting involved with culturing. And I had this situation come up where, number one, I've seen these structures that look like they're an erythrocyte. And there is a twist to this, by the way. And the twist is, it appears as though the original form of these, and by the way, this is what the professional medical person concluded also at the very beginning, was that these appear to be desiccated, is the word he used, okay? Freeze-dried. These are reduced in size. These are not like you just see a blood cell just popping around. It's like some kind of core structure that is impervious to adverse environmental conditions, would be the way I would say it. But then under the proper medium and environment can be reconstituted. And that was actually his big move. He called me down there because he had been playing around for either weeks or months trying to see if he could. He thought that these things looked like red blood cells, but he knew they were smaller than they should be. So he spent a great deal of time trying to see if he could come up with a reconstitution method of some kind. And he did, and that's when he called me. It was when he had a method of reconstituting them. That's when I went down there. Well, I got involved with cultures on my side. And I took these air samples, which had these apparent erythrocytes, and I started forming these cultures. And I had some really dramatic and immediate growths that took place. And like I would have done this several times and not say a word, because this is like really getting out there in terms of what's going on here. Because when I put these cultures under the microscope, it's like I had a zillion cells. And not only that, they were reconstituted, like they were at the right size. Okay? They just weren't. And I put up this paper called Extraordinary Biological Observations, and I wrote like one paragraph. And it's like, I don't know how to say it. No, nobody came after me. In fact, it's just that this was so important and so profound to me in terms of what's happening. Here's the problem, folks. You don't grow red blood cells in a test tube. You don't grow red blood cells. This is like the holy grail of biological research. is to be able to grow. I'm going to take questions afterwards. It's like the greatest achievement of current biology would be able to create blood cells. You just don't do it by conventional science. It's not under our purview right now. Now, there are some leads and suggestions, right, that there are some things going on that indicate that this is a very, very active field of research and that we would love to be able to do this. But in terms of the formal literature, do you have anyone saying at all that this could be done? Well, no. And not only that, Clifford Carnicom in his, bedroom laboratory, it's like bizarre. But this is what I saw, and I wrote it up, and it was so low-key. But if you look at that paper, I'm saying, this is what happened, folks. But I didn't want to make a big scene of it, but it's there if you look at it. And my point here in all of this is that, and I'm way out of sequence on the slides, but so what? The point here is that that biological entry on that list of 7, of which none of the other 6 are to be diminished, that biological one is gaining in terms of its repetition and dominance and prevalence in the work. Whether I like it or not, it's happening. And it's a particular form which is sort of so far out there that you could never expect to happen that it almost doesn't matter if you tell somebody because we can't believe it anyway. But this is what starts to develop. Okay, now you have a situation where people are demonstrating a certain set of physical conditions, and you have the emergence of a term called Morgellons. Right? This is also happening slowly in the background over the years. That you have this condition where people are manifesting certain symptoms, and it's starting to gather a little bit of attention in the public world, because what's happening, you know how we had this break in logic in terms of how I was presenting the research and it's all a hoax, but then underneath it's like, well, there's a lot of interest going on here? Well, sort of the same kind of thing was going on with this condition that was coming up, given the name Morgellons, that you had people manifesting filaments in their skin, okay? Sores that wouldn't heal and filaments in their skin. And it's like they were like physical. You could see them, and they would go to the doctor, and every time they went to the doctor, every time they would come out being branded as being delusional. I mean, literally on their medical records, they were being branded as being delusional. But they had physical things that you could see. And of course, you would take the obvious and you would analyze whether it can be a hair, right? You get rid of all the stuff to make sure nothing's going silly here. But that's all being done. And you can't dismiss this physical thing. It's not matching. It doesn't match a hair. Okay, a hair is about 60 to 100 microns thick. These things are more in the order of 15 to 20 microns or so thickness. But they're being branded as delusional, and this is happening now over a period of a couple years. And it's like, it's not really making sense, because now there is this pattern developing, and they never get the attention that is warranted. And you have a mockery being made of these people. And you see suffering. I mean, real suffering from this. And so what I'm doing, again, I can't do anything for a long time. I'm paying attention to it. But then there's a time, probably again another year and a half into it, whatever it takes. I wonder what the year and a half will be for today. But I get an individual that is manifesting these symptoms, and they say, you're welcome to look. I actually had 2 people over about a year period. I had the first one come in. I would have written up that paper, and I did. And then usually if I get something corroborated, that's when I'll start to go further with it. So you'll find an initial paper where I put them first under the microscope, and I say, this is what I see. Then I now have a person who I have direct contact with. This is an individual. The first one was sent by mail. And the person says, you can look at my samples. And so I start to dig in, and I start to get under the microscope. And what do I see? I start to see recurring themes again. And the recurring theme here is that what everybody else is calling a single fiber, as this is all being presented, some type of filament coming out of the skin, when I'm looking at it, and by the way, I did a lot of work over the years. You know, I started out with a $30 microscope, but I'm probably pretty proud of the microscope that I've jury-rigged now, because I'm running at about a 5,000 to 8,000 power commonly, and I know they're not perfect, you know, but I am able to see things that simply a conventional microscope can get you up to about 1,000 to 2,000 power. And then you have this jump up to the electron microscope up to 200,000. And it's like there's nothing in between except Rife, which some of us know about. And this guy was at 40 or 50,000, but we don't have him. So you have this huge gap in microscopy between what the little guy can do and then you get up to the big guys. Well, I've been able to bridge that up, extend it up just a little bit to get in the 5,000 to 8,000 range. And it's been quite fascinating in terms of what it opens up. I wish I had more. I'm at the limit of my resources. But I have done some clever work to try to push that using CCD stuff as best I can and jury-rigging Barlows and this type of thing. So I am able to see some things that simply are not seen in the general situation. And one of them is with this filament that people are calling a filament. What I'm seeing is that within the filament, there is this submicron internal network. Okay? This is a single filament, the whole thing, bounding, which most people are saying that's a filament. But when I look at them, I'm starting to see internal. There is this whole internal filament structure. And what? Its measurement is important to me. The size of things is important. It's one of your main methods of identification of things is size. Real important. So I always want to know the size. These internal filaments are at the submicron level. Okay? Well, there start to become slowly overlaps. And for me to properly describe this, you know, someone could challenge me and say, what's your basis for that? We'd have to dig into all these papers. But what's happening over the years now is that there is this overlapping that's taking place between certain environmental samples that I was aware of. Remember when I told you about the EPA filament that they wouldn't identify? Submicron range, remember that? I'm starting to see the same type of structure here, morphology and form, within fibers now manifesting at a biological level, not environmental. This is a gradual process, and this is controversial in that there are many individuals that would state that there appears to be really no logical or rational reason to try and connect the consequences of the aerosol operations with the so-called Morgellons issue. There are many people that would state that. I simply present the work that I have, and I must say that over the years as the work has developed, I have come out rather strong. I did one whole interview on it. But I will make an entire case to you involving a dozen papers over half a dozen years, presented in a very gradual and restrained fashion, I would say, that will document to you a very, very strong level of coincidence between certain environmental sample forms that have been analyzed and certain biological forms that are being analyzed. And this is a bridge that it's very, very serious to cross. And I'm not out to scare people. I am out to seek the truth best I can, and I am out to provide it the best I can. But this is a bridge that it appears many of us, we really don't want to cross this bridge. I don't have a choice right now in terms of where the work leads me. There does appear to be a very strong coincidence, and we could go into detail on this. They are certain repetitive structures and forms that are taking place, particularly this internal filament form, submicron, and also there is a you'll notice if you look at my papers, I keep calling attention, I'll keep saying this submicron structure. And it's one of those kind of things in my work that people that know the way I work, it might look really low-key the way I'm saying it, but if you will notice how many times I'm calling attention to that, and in this case, I don't know if we can see it here, but submicron, there. These little guys, very hard for you to see. but these are basically spherical. These are really small. These are like at 8,000 power. So for me to be able, nobody would see these with a regular scope. I wish I had more, but I can tell they're there. And we have a submicron spherical structure. This is of much interest to me. I don't know what it is. I've conjectured one thing. But I'm seeing these certain forms over and over and over again. So that'll be one of the main things that I want to impress upon you today, is that there is a strong basis of linkage between environmental and biological manifestation that is taking place. This Morgellons is an issue that has been characterized as being, that has been made a mockery of, but it becomes far more significant than most of us realize at this point, because I would now extend this discussion into 2 or 3 other aspects, and then I would plan on quitting here. But these 2 or 3 other aspects, and I'm not trying to scare you as I say this, but these 2 or 3 other aspects are important to divulge and discuss. And they're on my site, but certainly the word is not out there, and I'm not sure we really want it out there in that way. But here's what happens. Once you get past to this question of, is there any kind of overlap? Well, the problem goes deeper than that. Because the Morgellons, quote, issue, and by the way, I did meet with a doctor, and you know I said language is important? I met with this medical doctor, and he sort of says it's all screwed up to begin with, because you're not allowed to have a patient create the name for a disease. It's like not the way the system works. So Morgellons is like a problem from the beginning, because it wasn't formalized properly in the structure. Whether it's intentional or not is all other questions you can ask. But it has that stigma of the language attached to it. And this particular doctor tells me, sorry, that's not the way you play the game. The patient's not allowed to name the disease. So, you know, we have some problems with that. But we're using the term whether we like it or not. I will use that as opposed to chemtrails because it is what we know it as. And it does have a definition. Okay. You have certain people that are manifesting skin symptoms, and this issue is being characterized or framed as, oh, those poor unfortunate people that have that skin problem. It's a small little group off to the side. It's really not a part of my life. I don't see anything, so I really don't need to worry about it. This is the way that has been presented, and is. The CDC, okay, is, quote, involved in a study here. It's a study taking years, okay, treating it as this little section, hotspot area that's to be figured out over the years as to what it is, okay? Okay, that is how it is being characterized and framed. I'm not popular in terms of what I lead to here, but I'm not after popularity. And again, I'm not after scaring you. But these recurring themes that I'm talking about the filaments and the submicron structures, and also certain what I would call anomalies in the blood. I look at blood quite a bit, and there are certain anomalies that are occurring in blood that I'm seeing. And what's happened is I've looked at these people that are up there from the beginning of my work. All I can say is this is out there. It's out there. And I can't find anybody to do the work. I mean, I don't see the work being done. What's obvious to me to do is those as research. It's not being done. And to my knowledge, there is nothing that refutes what I'm saying at this point. I guess I should say I hope that it will be, but I can't right now. And so what I'm saying is that the notion of this consideration of this particular condition as affecting just a small segment of the population that we can treat as being off to the side like lepers does not appear to be justifiable to me. Okay, those are the plain facts of the situation. And the last thing that I wanted to mention comes around to this blood thing again. And that is the particular form of great interest has been a dental sample. This is one of many, but a dental sample is of particular interest. And the use of wine, it was an unusual situation how it was done, but the use of wine is producing this filament structure from the teeth, and so far it's actually everybody that's done it to some degree. And if you look at this filament structure that's coming, you see this same kind of thing. Well, the work that I've been doing over the last 6 months or so is it's back in that science fiction world again, because what's happening is I've seen that I'm able to culture these filaments. I'm able to grow them. See, to me, anytime you can culture something or grow it, it opens up a world of possibilities in terms of what now you can do to study that. Now you have something that you could put in the lab, right? You could study it. Controlled environment, classic science stuff. Well, I'm doing work with culturing of these filaments. And there are certain growths that are taking place that, again, are repeating this whole structure that I'm talking about over and over and over. And it becomes even more strange lately in that from these same cultures, there is I can't come to any other conclusion other than it appears there is I always say appear, but there is a blood cell that's appearing from this culture that makes just no sense at all, again, to be there. Again, you don't grow blood cells in a test tube, but it's happening from these filaments. And the part that's different about this test, and we're almost caught up to where I'm ending. I got one more and then I'm done. But when this was happening, where I was seeing this erythrocytic form from these filaments, this is when I sort of on my own, I said, man, I've had enough of this. You know, are these blood cells or not? I mean, they look like it, they measure like it. I've seen them a dozen times over the years, but are they or aren't they? And I really had to try to force the issue beyond what I could do visually. And so this time I really worked hard. It took me at least 2 months or 3 months to get through it. But I went to some what would be called forensic tests, things that would be satisfying the standards of a courtroom to determine whether or not this was blood, whether or not there was hemoglobin in it. And if you look at the work on this particular paper, that particular paper is titled Blood Issues Intensify. Okay? That's the title of that paper. If you look at that, you will see the documenting of 2 forensic level tests, again, done to the best of my ability. One's, was it Castlemeyer and Hemostix. These tests pass for the presence of hemoglobin from these filaments in a way I simply would not expect it, but they pass the test for hemoglobin, presence of hemoglobin. And again, it's out there, the methods are there, you can do it yourself, but this is what I'm seeing. And the most recent one, and this is sort of like just done a couple weeks ago, but the most recent one is not only has there been a culturing process that has been developed that shows these forms developing, but I did something to try and get into the actual fiber to break this apart. And we can call it intuitive hunch. We don't know where things happen sometimes, but sometimes some things happen in unusual and unexpected ways I can't always explain. But I did something to these fibers to see if I could break them down. And the 2 main things that are done there is you have an alkali solution, sodium hydroxide, a strong base, lye, and heat, both of these together. That combination appears to have broken down that filament structure. And there's pictures there and at the end. All I can say is that within the filaments, there are 2 structures that are showing up. And they again satisfy the conclusion I can make, the best I can, of an erythrocytic form and also that submicron structure. And I wonder, I don't know if I can get to it. It would probably be fitting if I can end this by showing you. Oh, I know why we're not seeing them. Guess what? You know how I said there were 2 parts? There's a whole nother set of photographs I never got to, and I'm not going to torture you through them, but I'm going to show the last picture of them. Because what's happening here, if I can get to it, I've used the word artificial blood, and I put a question mark by it. The best interpretation that I can make right now is that what is internal to these fibers appears to me, to be an artificial or a created form of blood. And the reason for that is twofold. Number one, because of their geometric purity. They're just so perfect if you look at them. I've looked at a lot of blood now, and I see a lot of variations. But these particular cells are just a perfect form. Now, I should have had these pictures going up that whole time I was talking. This is visually leading to what I've been describing all this time, the culturing work. Examination of the fibers. I'm after showing you inside. This is the stuff where the cells are coming from a culture form. And this is where it's passing the hemoglobin tests. Those are air bubbles from peroxide. It's a reaction in the Kastle-Meyer test. Hemosticks, positive test. This is the part where I'm talking about the actual fibers of heating them up within a lye solution. And it actually even looks like blood, to tell you the truth. When you're going, okay, what's coming out of this is the end of what I'm talking about. Within those, internal to the filaments, it's like it's too perfect. I don't see blood cells of this pure geometric form all the time. And remember about the two things I keep saying I'm seeing with respect to I'm seeing this internal submicron structure, and this really has my interest up, because we didn't even talk about it, but that's one of the blood variations that I'm seeing in individuals, is this appearance of this structure inside the blood. And so you can call it conjecture or hypothesis, I don't know, but if you read the paper, or it's called artificial blood, and it has a question mark after it. And I'm raising the question is, where does this come from? Also, by the way, this is an extremely hostile environment, right? This is lye and heat. This is not like the normal biological situation. Okay, so what are we dealing with here? And this is actual blood, and it's again that recurring structure inside. Those are blood cells that to me they're anomalous, and that's where the work is at. And you understand, I'm not trying to excite anybody into a state of fear. I'm a researcher. I present the work as fairly and honestly as I can. I do not claim to be right with everything that I do. I do claim to do the best that I can to try to seek the truth. And again, it brings us to considerations that many of us may not be comfortable with, but it is my duty to present them to you. And I'm going to shut up now. And I thank you very much. And we're going to take questions. But I thought maybe we'd take a break for 5 minutes, because you guys have been really patient. If you want, we can take a break for a couple minutes, and then we'll ask some questions. Is that fair?